Good to see each again this evening. I think you're right, Chad. No visitors lurking in our midst this evening, but glad to have each of you back this evening so that you may be edified and all of those others that are here this evening might be edified as well as we open up God's Word and glean from it truths that He would have us to know and to understand. Let's go ahead and open our Old Testaments to Exodus. Exodus. And we're going to talk about one who was drawn out. One who is drawn out. Let's talk about this one first, and then we will make some application there at the very end of our sermon this afternoon. Hope that everyone had a wonderful afternoon. Perhaps you got in a good power nap and ready to go for this evening, getting ready for this busy week. It's not, we're going to just blink our eyes and New Year's going to be here. So I tell you, yet another year, and then we're out of the teens right on into the 20s. Isn't that something? Isn't that something? But that's all right. And what about all those people that said, oh, the Lord's going to return? What about all those people? Has He returned? Yeah. I don't know. I don't know when He is going to return, but I know when He's not going to return. Whenever somebody says, oh, He's going to return on this date, well, you can mark it down. That's not when He's coming back. He's going to come back when it is the right time. Just when the Lord Jesus Christ came at the right time, He's going to come back at the right time as well. When we open our scriptures to the Old Testament, many times we look at the lives of these individuals and we say, oh, look at the miracles surrounding their lives and, that helped them in one way or another. And to a degree, I certainly am in the same way of thinking. Wouldn't it have been wonderful if we could have seen those miracles, when they actually occurred? But, it did not seem that those miracles that occurred really helped the majority of people. It certainly did not help those who were opposed to God and to His people. But those that desired to obey the God of heaven, then yes, those miracles did help them. But how are we to put those things into our lives today? Well, we put the biblical miracles into our lives just as we are to put lessons from other people's lives into effect in our lives as well. What do I mean by that? I mean that when I see pictures of people who have been on drugs for years and years and years and years, and seeing how wrinkled their skin is, how in poor health they are, the mental incapabilities. I don't want any part of that. So, since they experienced that, I'm going to learn from what they did, and I'm not going to do that. Just so, what about all the miracles that we find in the Bible? Just as it was to help those people in the day that it was performed, I'm going to learn from those miracles, the lesson that God gives to me by those miracles, and I'm going to learn. It's going to impact my life in a positive way. So, I don't have to behold, to see, to be an eyewitness to a miracle of God for it to affect my life. And so those things, Romans 15:4, those things that were written aforetime, the Old Testament scriptures, and the events that happened aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the scriptures might have hope. So let's take this idea of the Old Testament scriptures telling us some things and some miracles that were performed, yes, but not everything was by miracle. Most of it actually was providential. And so we will look at the life of Moses in this way. Moses means drawn out one, because of course Pharaoh's daughter drew him out of the river. And so we want to look at his particular story. First of all, his providential birth. Jesus was born by a virgin. A virgin conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Emmanuel. That virgin birth then was a miracle. Moses was not born miraculously. He was born providentially, just as all of us were. We were all born, folks, providentially. So we are as Moses was. He was born in difficult circumstances. What were those circumstances? Well, when you go to Exodus 1, there beginning with verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. He was unaware of, well, not unaware of Joseph, but he did not realize Joseph, how great he was, and the events surrounding how Joseph helped Egypt in a terrible time. And so he put those things out of his mind. Perhaps he was not taught those things, as is frequently the case. And so as a result, he saw the children of Israel who were up in the land of Goshen as a great threat because they're multiplying. And the people of Egypt understood this in a very real way. And so he said to the midwives, the Egyptian midwives that went to the Hebrew women, he said, when you go and do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, this is verse 16, chapter 1, and you see them on the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. Now, this begs the entire question, does it not? Wow. Oh, nope, there we go. Accidentally hit that one. This just begs the question, doesn't it? What about what's going on in this country today? Is this not the exact same thing that's going on? Was Pharaoh righteous in what he was telling these women, or was he unrighteous in what he was telling them? If he was unrighteous in telling these Hebrew midwives to murder these baby boys, then it is as unrighteous in the exact same way, not different, in the exact same way to do what our nation is doing, or at least proposing to do today. It is evil then to take the life of a child, whether that child is yet in the womb or just born. That is a life that must be preserved. And so Moses, though, third child, Miriam, Aaron. Aaron's about 3 years older. Moses then born. And so even in this difficult circumstance, Jochebed wanted to do the right thing, and she hid Moses for about 3 months. Go to chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. When she could no longer hide him, she hid him for 3 months in verse 2. I guess I should start there. And the woman conceived and had a son, and when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. So put your finger right there, by the way. When you see a child, shouldn't that stir something up in you? Shouldn't that stir something up in you? I know she already took her out, but, little Miss Brianna, you see her and you just, something happens to your heart, right? If something doesn't happen to you, maybe you need heart surgery or something. That's how we ought to be. But some of us have our hearts seared with a hot iron, right? And so here is this godly woman. She sees this wonderful, precious little boy, and I have to. Well, that should be her reaction. And so she hid him for 3 months, verse 3. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. And notice verse 4. Oh, and there's the sister Miriam. She stood afar off to know what would be done to him. And so Jochebed, after 3 months, had to give Moses to the Lord. What part of a miracle was that? Was there a miracle anywhere involved in this? No, see, it's all providential. The natural process of life occurred, and Moses was born. The natural process of her desire to keep him as long as possible, that occurred. And then she put him there in that little makeshift boat or ark and put him there in the river to see what would happen. She gave him to the Lord. And God then blessed her because she did that which was right. In verses 7 and 8, here's verse 4, there's Miriam, see what would do. Pharaoh's daughter came, and she and her maidens, they found Moses, and Pharaoh's daughter drew him out of the water, and she noticed this is a Hebrew child. You notice she knew that this was not an Egyptian child. But he cried. Can you imagine a little 3-month-old crying? What's your natural reaction? Men and women, what's our natural reaction to a little crying 3-month-old? I got to do everything I can to take care of this baby. That's our natural reaction. Are we not glad Pharaoh's daughter had that same reaction? Even though she understood, do you think she knew her her father's order to kill the Hebrew boys? She already knew that, and even she defied that because her natural state then took over, and we're glad that it did. Again, no miracle done. All that was providential. Go down to verse 7 and verse 8. Then said his sister, because she was watching from afar off, and she approached Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. And the maid went and called the child's mother. Women, how would you, and moms, how would you like to get paid to raise your children? Jochebed she was paid to raise Moses. Isn't that something? Egypt, knowing his Hebrew background, and also in the palace of Pharaoh. But when he was 40 years old, he decided that he wanted to leave Egypt, at least leave the Egyptian people and fully be with his people, the people of God. In chapter 2, beginning with verse 11, and it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens. And he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way. And when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together. And he said to him that did the wrong, wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he said, who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killest the Egyptian? And Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. So the man that was saved from the Egyptian went and told all of his buddies what Moses did. He killed the Egyptian. You know, isn't it something that people that are afraid will see salvation as something to be feared? Isn't that something? And that's exactly what the Hebrew people were doing at this time. They were seeing that this salvation from the Egyptians, from their slavery, oh no, this is not a good thing. No, that's not a good thing at all. Who made you a prince over us? Now that's going to come back to Moses. That very thought and idea is going to come back to him. Even though Moses providentially decided of his own free will, I'm going to leave the people of Egypt. I'm not going to be identified with the people of Egypt, even though I grew up in the palace. But I'm going to be identified with the people of God. And so what did he do after that period of time? He fled Egypt and he went into Midian, beginning with verse 15. And so we pick up here in verse 18, as Moses then helped the family, the 7 daughters of Reuel, or in chapter 3 we see Jethro, same individual. And when they came to rule their father, he said, how is it that ye are come so soon today? Because apparently this happens every day. These 7 girls go out there. And, was it a woman's world or a man's world back then, by the way? Oh, it was a man's world, you see. And so the men came in. They didn't care about these ladies and their flocks. They came in and they put them out of the way, and they made sure they had their water, and they made sure their flocks had their water. And then the ladies, after they did all the work, then they got the leftovers. Do we see how that works? Moses, however, what did he do? He stood up for these girls. That's what he did. You see, and that's what the people of God do. They stand up for the weak. They stand up for those who are disadvantaged. That's what the people of God do. That's what Moses did on this particular occasion. But notice, if somebody says there's no humor in the Bible, they've never read God's Word. At least they've never read it with my eyes anyway. So we go down to verse 19 of chapter 2. And they said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds. He looked like an Egyptian. Well, he came from Egypt, but he was actually Hebrew. And also drew water enough for us and watered the flock. And he said unto his daughters, well, where is he? Why is it that ye have left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread. They didn't even ask him in to eat with them. They just left him out there. Just like you women. But this is real life, isn't it? You see how it really happens? This is it. How much of that was a miracle, by the way? No, none of it was a miracle. These are everyday occurrences, you see, that's happening, going on, but making a big impact on the life of Moses and the people of Israel. Let's continue on verse 20 here. Verse 21, rather. And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses Zipporah his daughter, and she bare him a son and called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. So here's Moses for 40 more years, growing up, if you will, from 40 to 80 years old in the land of Midian among this particular family. Now we have our first miracle. God had to call Moses, because see, he would have stayed out there in the land of Midian with his family until he died. There was no reason for him to go back to Egypt. So the Lord had to take him by the shoulders and shake him up a little bit and grab his attention. How did he do that? Well, he did it by miracle, because he wanted to prove something to Moses. And we pick up verse 2 of chapter 3. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in the flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I'll turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Now, Moses understood who Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were, did he not? Because God said, I am the God of your father. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses knew who that was. How did Moses know who that was? Did Pharaoh and Pharaoh's daughter teach him that? No. Jochebed taught him that, did she not? We know that to be the case. And therefore he was afraid, because he knew that he was looking at God. Well, he didn't actually see God, of course. He just saw that the bush was burning and not consumed. Now there's our first miracle. But note that it took a lot more than that to change Moses' mind. Now think about that. Moses had great faith. And yet this miracle of this burning bush was not enough for him to just, all right, stand up straight, turn and do 180 degrees and go right back and march into Egypt. That's not what happened, is it? No, it is not. But he did become a leader of God's people. He did go to Egypt, even though he gave some excuses. He went to secure the release of the children of Israel. Chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord God your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared unto me, saying, I have surely visited you, and seen that which is done to you in Egypt. And I have said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt unto the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, unto a land flowing with milk and honey. And so Moses went about leading God's people out of Egyptian bondage, but not before, even in the presence of this burning bush, not before giving some excuses. In verse 11 of chapter 3, I can't speak. I'm not an orator. That's what Moses would put out to God. Well, I tell you what, I'll give you Aaron, your brother. He can be your spokesperson. Oh, well, why don't you send someone else? Chapter 4 and 10, 13. You just send someone else. I'm not the right man for the job. God was not amused. God had chosen who he wanted to lead the people out of Egypt, and it was Moses. But he needed a little bit of encouragement, and it was going to take a little bit more than that burning bush as a result. And so he was going to, and because God prepared him, that he was going to get resistance from Pharaoh. And I said unto thee, let my son go, that he may serve me. And the Lord said unto Moses, when thou goest to return unto Egypt, see that thou do all those wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in thine hand. But I will harden his heart, that he shall not let the people go. And so God prepared him. You're going to go to Pharaoh, and he's not going to let my people go. You need to stick it out. And guess what? Moses did just that. At first, he gave a number of excuses. Lord, pick somebody else. I can't speak very well. I'm slow of tongue. I'm not very eloquent. I'm just not the right man for the job. God said, yes, you are. And you take your brother Aaron, and I'm going to give you these signs. And you're going to lead my people out of Egypt. But it's not going to be easy. And so Moses went back to Egypt and did as God told him to do. Now, all those providential things occurred, and yet God still needed to prove some things, not to Moses. Notice that the 10 plagues were not for Moses, but the 10 plagues were for Pharaoh and the people of Egypt, that the people might know, and not just even Egypt, but even the Canaanites, the people that they were going to go to, that the plagues were for all of them. They were not for Moses. He already believed. He was already faithful. He was already leading the people. He did not need any miracles. It was for those that did not believe. And so God gave him a couple of miracles there at the very beginning, especially to prove to the children of Israel that God sent him. And so he said, take the rod, and I want you to throw it down. It's going to become a serpent. And he did that, and Moses fled. Well, John said he was going to flee too. Well, then God said, now you got to pick him up by the tail. And Moses, as scared as he was, he did that. He took the snake by the tail, and it became a rod again. Then he took his hand, and he put it into his coat, and he pulled it out, and it was white with leprosy. Leprosy, of course, was inoperable. It was a fatal condition, and they could do nothing about it. And so now his hand is leprous. And God said, okay, now put it back in your coat and draw it out. And he did that, and it was all made all better again, miraculously, so that the people would know, the children of Israel would know that God indeed sent him. And of course, Aaron would throw the rod down before Pharaoh. and say, this is God, and God said, let my people go. Now, the servants of Pharaoh, the magicians, they threw their rods down, and they turned to snakes too. But Aaron's snake ate theirs. And Aaron picked the snake by the tail up, and it turned back into a rod. But because of that, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not let the people go. Then, of course, we're obviously not going to read all of these chapters, Exodus 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. But within the pages of these particular chapters are the 10 plagues, and the 10 plagues that ended in the death of the firstborn. And it took probably a good while for these 10 plagues to occur over many, many months, and perhaps even a couple of years, that these 10 plagues then occurred, in order that Pharaoh might understand that it was the God of heaven, the God of the children of Israel, that was in control, and not the gods that the Egyptians worshiped. And the final one, of course, was the death of the firstborn. And at that then, Pharaoh sent the children of Israel out. And yet, after they were gone, Pharaoh changed his mind again. And he pursued the people. And he said, oh, I need them back. But you see, that was also by design. That also was not a miracle that Pharaoh changed his mind. That was providential. But what was miraculous, of course, was the crossing of the Red Sea. Let's go to Exodus 14, beginning with verse 20. Here are the people right here at the coast of the Red Sea, looking over and needing to get to the Sinai Peninsula. And of course, the people are crying because the Egyptians are now coming up against them. And go down to verse 20. And Moses stretched out his hand over the Red Sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon dry ground, and the waters were a wall unto them on the right hand and on the left. And the Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, even all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And it came to pass that in the morning watch the Lord looked unto the host of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire of the cloud, and troubled the host of the Egyptians, and took off their chariot wheels, that they drave them heavily, so that the Egyptians said, let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fighteth for them against the Egyptians. And the Lord said unto Moses, stretch out thine hand over the sea, that the waters may come again upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen. And Moses stretched forth his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its strength when the morning appeared. And the Egyptians fled against it. And the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen and all the host of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. There remained not so much as one of them. But the children of Israel, they walked upon dry land in the midst of the sea. And the waters were a wall unto them on their right and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. The Egyptians understood that God fought for them because they were looking the other direction. And here's the Egyptians that are coming up behind, but they could not overtake the Lord. They couldn't do it. And so as a result, all the children of Israel passed safely through the waters. They were baptized unto Moses, folks. Can you imagine that great sight? And then the Egyptians were all killed as a result of their unrighteousness. They would not let the people of God go. They had to hold on to them, and they paid mightily for that. Now, where then do we grab and get some application? Let's go to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. Note with me verse 23. All of these things happened for our learning. What should we then glean from this particular occasion. Hebrews 11:23 beginning. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents. By the way, was that Moses' faith or his parents' faith? Well, when you're 3 months old, you can't have any faith, can you? So obviously it was his parents' faith, because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. We're going to obey God rather than men, is what Peter would have said. Verse 24, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians essaying to do were drowned. So all of the things that we studied in Exodus, chapters 1 to 14, are all mentioned here in Hebrews chapter 11. So what then is our lesson? You have Amram and Jochebed, those Moses' parents. They had faith. They are as much responsible as the safe passage of the children of Israel leaving Egypt as anyone else. What miracle was performed in those decisions? Not one. Moses decided, I do not want to be Pharaoh's daughter's son, be in the palace. I'm going to forsake Egypt and be with God's people. What miracle was performed in that decision? Not one. The children of Israel then crossed the Red Sea. Yes, there was obviously a miracle in that particular occasion, but they still had to walk through it. God didn't zap them up from one side and deposit them on the other side immediately, did He? No, they passed through the Red Sea. God was with them every step of the way, and He destroyed their enemies as a result. We need to have the kind of faith that would help us to give other people to God, that would help us go through life allowing God to lead us in His way. And even when it seems to us and to the world to be the wrong decision, to be the wrong way, when you're doing things that God says to do, it's never wrong. And it will always lead you to the right destination. Where did the children of Israel need to go? To the promised land. Where does the Christian need to go? To the promise through faith. So I read my Bible and I glean the lessons of the Old Testament so that I can understand how they interacted with God, the people interacted with God, and the people that... And so I follow the pages of the New Testament, the commandments of Jesus the Christ, and He tells the world in turning toward the cross that I need to confess Him with my mouth and that I need to be baptized into His death, contacting His blood for the remission of my sins. If you have not done that, you can do that this very hour. If you have and yet you have not been applying the Scriptures to your life as you should, then you might need to come back to Him. If you have a need this evening, why don't you come right now while we stand and sing. Bring Christ your